March 17, 1943, Berlin. General Alfred Jodl laughed disdainfully as he twirled through his fingers a report coming from Mexico City. It read that the Americans were producing 1 bomber per hour. "They only know how to make razors and automobiles," he said. By his side, Wilhelm Canaris did not answer. He just watched silently as his coffee cooled next to a pile of documents that, if true, challenged everything German military intelligence believed about its enemies. That laughter, drowned out by cigar smoke and ideological hubris, was about to be silenced, not by bombs, but by statistics. What the Germans called American propaganda was actually a logistical avalanche built of steel, rivets, and industrial discipline. A single Ford plant called Willow Run in the state of Michigan was producing 1.5 million-piece B-24 bombers every 63 minutes. This is the documented account of how Hitler's German spies, engineers, and even ministers were forced to face the reality they tried to deny, the strength of democracy on a production scale. Because in this war, the enemy wasn't just the American military, it was mathematics. And mathematics does not lie. But before we dive into the data, there is a statistic that defines this story, and that seemed impossible in the eyes of German intelligence. In the midst of the war, as the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its air force supplied, a single American factory, Willow Run, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber with more than 1.5 million pieces every 63 minutes. It was faster than Germany could assemble an infantry truck, more accurate than any German tactical engineering project, more untenable than any Nazi doctrine could admit. And the most shocking, all this was supported by women, immigrants, and workers who had never assembled an airplane in their lives. How was this possible? How did the production line of a democracy, considered inefficient by the Nazis, become the greatest threat to the Third Reich? If you value history, rigorous research, and the truth behind the statistics that decided wars, please leave your like and subscribe. This helps this channel to continue revealing what many prefer to forget. In 1941, 2 years before German intelligence collapsed in front of Ford's assembly line, the first signs were already on Hermann Göring's desk. Reports from the German military attaché in Washington, General Friedrich von Boetticher, warned of a quiet but colossal movement taking place behind the scenes in American industry. Karl Köhler, then the Luftwaffe's representative in the United States, sent consistent data. American aircraft production had exceeded 2,000 units per month, with even bolder projections for the following year. Göring did not hesitate. Between a puff of cigar and a sip of brandy, he laughed out loud. Americans only know how to make refrigerators and razors. A bomber requires spirit, purity of blood, and Prussian discipline. The comment was met with tense smiles in the upper echelons of the Reich. No objection, no questioning, just the repetition of a mistake that would change the course of the war, believing that technical efficiency could only exist under authoritarian command. In the minds of Göring, Hitler's top brass, and many German generals, the United States was a messy, racially diluted, morally decadent, and technically dispersed democracy, in no way comparable to the German order. The prejudice was so deep that the data brought by diplomats and spies was simply discarded. The propaganda ministry reinforced the narrative that American power was a theatrical illusion fed by Jews and the entertainment industry. Meanwhile, in the state of Michigan, civilian workers were building what would soon become the largest bomber production complex in human history. The irony increases when one considers that the Germans, masters of mechanical precision, failed to realize the value of standardization at scale. The Heinkel, Junkers, and Messerschmitt factories produced aircraft at an artisanal pace. Each batch varied, each model required manual adjustments, and the average time to assemble an He-111 bomber reached 15,000 hours of work. In the United States, Ford was preparing to deliver a B-24 bomber in less than 300 hours of assembly, thanks to the extreme division of tasks, the use of standardized subassemblies, and the partial automation of the steps. It was an invisible revolution for those who judged the world based on racial purity and military tradition. While Canaris, head of the Abwehr, insisted on passing on the technical reports to the higher authorities, his documents were filed with the stamp of psychologically improbable. Hitler's phrase, repeated several times in 1942, was categorical. Democracy will slow them down, their half-blood will make them fragile, and their lack of collective purpose will lead them to failure. None of these premises resisted the facts. By 1941, American aircraft production was already 4 times greater than Germany's. 4 times. And this was even before Willow Run started operating. This is the factual moment that defines the strategic shock. In 1941, the United States produced more than 19,000 planes, Germany less than 5,000. A disparity that not only remained, it multiplied in the following years. If this statistic surprises you, comment below with "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what happened. The German mistake, however, was not only to underestimate the production, it was to deny the concept of society in motion. In Germany, workers were silent resources. In the United States, they were mobilized citizens. Ford offered accelerated technical training to women who had never been to a plant. Black men were promoted to supervisors. Young people learned to operate industrial machines even before they turned 18. This social mobilization frightened the Nazis, but instead of studying the phenomenon, they preferred to reject it as a product of propaganda. General Alfred Jodl even commented at a meeting in the Wolfschanze, "If it is true that they train housewives to rivet aircraft, then we have already lost." The phrase was said in a joking tone, drowned out by the laughter of officers who did not know that the war they would face would not only be at the front, it would be on the clock, in the factories, on the assembly line. Their world, centered on the doctrine of ethnic superiority, had no room to accept that the greatest threat to the Reich would come from anonymous workers and industrial statistics. Meanwhile, Willow Run's timer was already being adjusted. The plant, still in the process of being finalized, promised something unthinkable for the European model of warfare: a bomber ready every hour, transported by internal rails, inspected in real time, fueled, and flying on the same day. Soon the skies of Europe would see what Hitler's cabinet refused to see. Democracy could make airplanes like it makes cars, and that was far worse than any secret weapon. But what none of them knew in 1941 was that a German spy, undercover at a diplomatic reception in Mexico, had already heard and memorized every detail of the production line that would destroy Nazi confidence. In the next part, we'll look at how a careless tequila-fueled dinner put the secret of the world's largest factory in the hands of the enemy, and why, even with all the evidence, Berlin still chose to turn a blind eye. The genesis of Willow Run began quietly, far from the trenches, without speeches, without fanfare. It did not involve generals, soldiers, or tanks. It began with a hand-drawn drawing, drawn at night, in the hotel room of a man in the industry. Charles Sorensen, chief engineer and director of production at Ford Motor Company, had just visited the Consolidated Aircraft facility in San Diego. What he saw there, bombers being built outdoors under the sun, with variations between models, long lines of improvised assembly, did not impress him. On his makeshift drawing board, Sorensen scribbled a radical plan. A heavy bomber, such as the B-24 Liberator, would no longer be built as a work of craftsmanship. It would be mounted like an automobile, in continuous flow. When the U.S. government decided to convert civilian industry to the war effort, Henry Ford, already in his 70s, hesitated. But Sorensen, a veteran of the Model T assembly line, saw the challenge as an engineering opportunity. The goal was to build a factory capable of producing bombers at an industrial pace. To do so, it would be necessary to solve what no other country had solved: transform 5 million parts into a functional, reliable, and standardized war machine, without depending on specialized craftsmen or engineers. It was a paradigm shift. They located a flat plot of land in the state of Michigan, between the cities of Ypsilanti and Belleville. The name of the place was Willow Run. In 1940, it was a farm. In 1941, it was a construction site. In 1942, it became the largest indoor factory in the world, a building with more than 5 million square feet, larger than any industrial complex in Europe, and the most ambitious. Its internal layout was designed so that the plane literally flowed from raw material to flight. The production line was straight to the end, but as the test track could not exceed the limits of the neighboring state, the building ended with an L curve, respecting the border. It was a perfect metaphor for efficiency adapted to freedom. The plan was to build 500 bombers per month. This would require about 45,000 employees operating in 3 shifts. Most of them had never worked with metal, rivets, or aero engines. They were peasants, waiters, housewives, barbers, light line workers. Sorensen and his team created something even more revolutionary than the assembly line: an accelerated training system that turned ordinary civilians into single-function specialists. Each worker performed a standardized operation, simple, repeated hundreds of times a day. Perfection was attained not by individual talent, but by the exact repetition of tiny tasks. The plant was equipped with more than 1,600 specialized machine tools, many designed exclusively for specific B-24 assembly operations. The logistics chain that fed Willow Run crossed states and time zones. V-1710 engines were shipped from Buick. Wheels and brakes came from Bendix. Firestone hydraulic systems. Aluminum parts arrived from dedicated trains that transported hundreds of tons of the metal weekly. It was a mechanical ecosystem that functioned like a living organism. Boxes with numbered pieces were delivered in sections marked on the floor. Internal rails carried subassemblies, wings, fuselages, landing gears, from one wing to another. Each plane went through more than 60,000 separate operations, performed in timed sequence. At the end of the line, inspection technicians spent hours checking screws, tolerances, and finishes. Afterwards, the plane was taken to a side runway, stocked, tested, and it took off for the front. From a technical standpoint, Willow Run wasn't just a factory. It was the greatest embodiment of the American doctrine of total mobilization. Unlike Germany, where factories were decentralized, many operating in small towns and with technical autonomy, the Americans concentrated forces in gigantic production centers, based on planning, mathematics, and logistical agility. This allowed not only to scale, but to adapt. When a part had a problem, the entire line was informed. When a new B-24 model needed alteration, the conversion time was days, not months. Germany, with its obsession with elite engineers, despised this model. For them, standardization was synonymous with mediocrity. Mass production, a sign of vulgarity. Ford showed the opposite, that efficiency can be more deadly than genius alone, and that a functioning democracy, even if imperfect, is capable of producing at a war pace without having to march in unison. In its early months, Willow Run struggled with delays, design glitches, and learning curves. But as the system adjusted, the rate of production skyrocketed. In 1943, the factory already exceeded 300 planes per month. At its peak in 1944, it produced 453 bombers in 468 hours, an 18-ton aircraft with 2 bomb bays, 4 engines, and a range of 3,200 kilometers, completed every 63 minutes. And here comes the paradox that no German analyst has been able to resolve. How did a supposedly fragmented, racially impure society, led by civilian politicians, produce war machines more efficiently than the Reich? The answer lay not in military secrets, but in spreadsheets, mass training, and production philosophy. What Hitler considered disorganization was, in fact, intelligent decentralization. What Himmler called cultural weakness was productive diversity. And what Goering called propaganda theater was the most powerful factory in the world working in silence. But the most disconcerting thing was yet to come, because as Willow Run stepped up its line, German intelligence began to receive information from multiple sources, and they all said the same thing. This was not a rumor. It was real. 1 bomber every hour, with proofs, drawings, and testimonies. And the most curious thing, the data came from where it was least expected. From diplomatic dinners, parties in embassies, and carefree conversations with American businessmen in Mexico. In the next part, we will look at how a glass of tequila and a scribbled napkin revealed to German intelligence what their generals refused to see. In 1943, after months of misinformation and comfortable silence, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, finally came across the truth. German espionage had collected reports from a number of reliable sources, Mexicans, Swedes, and Spaniards, all warning of a phenomenon that no one wanted to believe. What he read in the pages of these messages was beyond what anyone in Berlin would have dared to imagine. American aircraft production was not only real, but already exceeded any optimistic estimate by the Allies themselves. The Willow Run plant, in particular, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, a pace unheard of in the history of the industry. The factory, which no one believed could sustain such production, was already producing 450 bombers a month, and projections indicated that this number would grow even more. When Canaris read the numbers, his mind immediately confronted the same question that haunted any intelligent military thinker in Germany: how to combat an enemy that is producing more planes than we are capable of shooting down. Canaris knew what that meant. In theory, if the United States continued at this pace, it could soon have air superiority not only in the West, but throughout Europe. For Germany, which was already struggling to keep its aircraft production running, this logistical chasm seemed like a death sentence. But there is something more complex in reality than the simple technical answer, and Canaris knew that if he presented this information to Hitler, he would be immediately silenced. Hitler would never accept the idea that a democracy, considered fragile and decadent by the Nazis, could be more productive than the Reich. Convincing Hitler of this would not only pose an irreparable political risk, but it would also threaten the very belief structure of the Nazi leadership, which was based on Germany's racial and military superiority. It was a truth that, if exposed, could destroy confidence in war as they knew it. Thus, Canaris found himself in a dangerous dilemma. The weight of the information was overwhelming, but the truth he possessed, far from being a solution, was a ticking time bomb. How to convince the military command that the enemy was much stronger than everyone imagined, when the German power structure itself was based on myths of invincibility and racial purity. As absurd as it was, this information represented Germany's only chance of salvation, but at the same time it meant its instant collapse if it was shared with the Nazi leadership. The internal doubt that Canaris faced became more and more oppressive. How could the Reich survive this kind of revelation? And most importantly, if he didn't act, how could he take on an enemy that was arming itself faster than anyone could have imagined? The production of aircraft in the United States was now beyond the capacity of any German armament to be stopped. By 1942, the U.S. had manufactured more planes than Germany had in the entire war up to that point. And the gap continued to widen. Factories, such as Ford, were quickly adapting to the needs of the war. What were once assembly lines for automobiles were now factories of mass destruction. In a single month, more than 1,000 B-24 bombers were completed. And this was not a momentary peak, but the steady pace that the factories had achieved, which would continue to increase. What was even more shocking to Canaris was the fact that this information was being brought in by agents who had never been considered reliable or relevant to the eyes of German intelligence. The Abwehr's own espionage system had neglected sources that now proved invaluable. The flow of information from areas such as Mexico City, where American businessmen met freely, and Sweden, where European diplomats had access to industrial data, was crucial. These informants were ordinary people, with no connection to the U.S. government, who unknowingly brought to the Reich the secret of true American strength, the ability to produce more than the enemy could destroy. As he tried to understand the significance of these discoveries, Canaris felt overwhelmed by a disconcerting truth. America's war machines were being manufactured not in secret laboratories or under the hands of genius scientists, but by ordinary civilians who were not subject to a regime of fear or military order. Unlike in Germany, where labor mobilization was based on doctrines of military discipline and obedience, the Americans had organized around a flexible system of mass production, a strategy that involved taking full advantage of the available labor force. Skilled workers, yes, but also women, immigrants, and African Americans. This diversity of origins, far from being a weakness, fed the production line with a unique energy. Meanwhile, in Germany, factories were overly dependent on too few highly skilled workers, which limited their ability to ramp up production quickly. In Europe, the production of weapons and aircraft was rooted in a hierarchical system, where decisions were slow to be made and reactions to failures were slow. The Americans, on the other hand, had created a network of logistical efficiency that adapted to the needs of war, responding in real time to problems and scaling their solutions with unprecedented speed. American factories were scattered all over America, in places like Detroit, where even the humblest local populations were trained to operate the most advanced machines. The flexibility of American factories was unmatched. Yet, despite all the knowledge, Canaris knew that this truth could not be revealed. In a Germany where any sign of defeat was treated as treason, any evidence of failure in the war apparatus would be enough to crumble morale. And indeed, if there was a fatal miscalculation, he could be Canaris himself, if he were seen as the man who brought the bad news. Canaris's dilemma now was that this revelation not only threatened his position, but the very future of Germany. How could someone so rational, so calculating, deal with this bomb he had in his hands? And more importantly, how could he convince Hitler of the truth without being considered a traitor? In the next segment, We'll look at what happened when Canaris finally made the decision to present the information, how Göring's arrogance and Hitler's dogmatism became the greatest weakness of the Reich, unable to see the imminent threat. But before that, reality would become even harder to swallow. It was an ordinary night in Mexico City in 1943, when American oil company executive Harold Morrison was invited to a dinner at the headquarters of the Mexican-German Trade Association. The atmosphere was light, relaxed, watered down with tequila and conversations about business and war. Morrison, who had just returned from a visit to the Willow Run factory, was unaware that by sharing his impressions, he was about to provide crucial information to his own nation's enemies. Sitting next to a man posing as an Argentine leather dealer, Morrison was asked to describe his recent visit to Ford's massive bomber-making plant. The factory, where the production of airplanes seemed to be arranged with unusual precision, was the subject of his account. "It's something impressive, almost impossible to describe," Morrison said. "The assembly line is so big that sometimes clouds form inside it. They have 42,000 workers, many of them women, black women, building the most complex of war devices." The man in front of him, smiling discreetly, listened attentively, apparently not realizing the gravity of what was being said. This Argentine leather dealer was in reality Wolfgang Blau, an undercover agent of German intelligence. The agent memorized Morrison's every word, without haste, without arousing suspicion. The conversation continued, with details about the Willow Run blueprint, about the sub-assemblies of the aircraft, how the fuselages arrived on one side, the wings on the other, and how the pieces fit together like a gigantic puzzle. Morrison did not know that his reports would be immediately relayed to Berlin, passing through a spy network that was already beginning to become increasingly efficient. The daily lives of Americans, in their transparency, were offering the country's enemies a detailed view of the greatest war production in history. No torture, no intense interrogation, no life-threatening undercover spy, but a simple dinner washed down with tequila, a casual conversation, the kind of information that, if carefully analyzed, would crumble Nazi pride. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Nazis were looking for secret, hidden answers, when all they had to do was listen to Americans' own conversations. The factories, the production plans, the technical efficiency, all were being revealed in the simplest of exchanges, in the most innocent of interactions. The sources that could save the Reich were being ignored or dismissed as irrelevant. For Abwehr officers, this data came not from highly trained agents, but from ordinary workers and a democracy they considered inferior. America, in its almost unbeatable industrial pace, did not hide. On the contrary, the nation proudly showed its achievement. Letters exchanged between factory workers, telling their families about the long shifts, the assembly process, the tireless manufacture of airplanes, were being intercepted by German agents. But even when the data reached the ears of Reich leaders, the eyes stubbornly ignored it. Prejudice was stronger than any statistics. The idea that a country deemed racially impure could produce more than a militarily superior empire was inconceivable. This gap in understanding was one of the greatest failures of German intelligence, the inability to see beyond its own ideology. The thought that efficiency and industrial capacity depended on racial and military purity was destructive. In fact, what the Americans were proving, day in and day out in their factories, was the exact opposite of what the Nazis believed. It was the strength of the collective, the union of different ethnicities and sexes around a common effort, that created a war machine far more effective than any militarized production line or one based on a rigid ideology. But the Germans were not alone. The whole world was beginning to notice. What seemed like an innocent conversation, an exchange of words at a dinner party, would soon become the key to the defeat of one of the most powerful powers in history. And all this, in a scenario where traditional espionage with its secret agents and military operations was not necessary. The simple daily lives of Americans, their work routines, their casual conversations, their transparency, were revealing what the leaders of the Reich refused to see. And that made it all the more ironic. While the strongest enemy was busy preparing to attack, the real war was being won in the factories, where anonymous men and women were creating the most efficient military might the world had ever seen. If you're struck by the irony of this story, please like and subscribe so we can continue unraveling these fascinating events. The next part brings us to a pivotal moment, Canaris finally decides to share these revelations with the upper echelons of the Reich. How the empire that had everything to win ignored the truth, and how much political arrogance accelerated its own downfall. The B-24 Liberator, the machine the Germans never thought could be built, was made up of a staggering 1.5 million individual parts, 450,000 rivets, 4 V-1710 engines designed to fly at extreme altitudes, hundreds of interdependent systems, each essential to the functioning of the whole. To German engineers and officials, the concept of building a bomber of this size with such complexity at a steady pace was nothing short of a challenge to logic and common sense. The B-24 was not a simple machine, but an exercise in precision, where each component had to fit together with absolute accuracy to ensure the performance of the whole. Realizing that this aircraft was assembled every 63 minutes, the Nazi leadership was faced with an unbearable reality. While the Germans were building warplanes at an artisanal pace with unique, manually tuned models, Ford had managed to turn the manufacture of airplanes into a mass operation, more efficient than any European industrial production. And what the Germans could not understand most was the technique that underpinned this, the division of labor. Each section of the assembly line was responsible for a specific task, repeated millions of times. Production was decentralized, yes, but in a meticulously organized manner, with each worker responsible for a single function that, in combination with the others, made it possible to produce an entire aircraft in less than a day. For each task, a station has been created. Each station, like a piece of a puzzle, operated independently but interconnected. The Americans' work was focused on logistical efficiency, not design complexity or craftsmanship perfection. The result? An absurdly high amount of planes rolling off the production line and challenging the very notion of war. This structure was incomprehensible to the German aircraft industry, where, instead of fluid assembly lines, highly specialized engineers and workers assembled aircraft almost one at a time. The part that arrived at a German aircraft factory required a detailed process of adjustment and improvement, and this took weeks, even months. To the Germans, the idea of producing airplanes like a passenger car, where parts arrived on the assembly line and fit together automatically, seemed not only impossible, but also unworthy of their vision of war. The mindset was clear. Mass production was for simple products, not such sophisticated war machines. The arrogance was so great that the mere concept of a bomber being manufactured like a car assembly line seemed like heresy. Meanwhile, the Americans were achieving a monumental feat, not just because of the number of planes produced, but because of the revolutionary approach to how the parts connected. Almost magically, the sub-assembly system allowed parts and components to be made in multiple factories throughout the United States and come together in one centralized location. The system was made to be resilient. If a section of an assembly line failed, parts could be quickly relocated to another factory. The components arrived already standardized and pre-tested, saving assembly time. The power of logistics and coordination became increasingly evident. The final product was not just a warplane, it was a symbol of how innovation at scale could win over ideology itself. The Germans, with their focus on producing extremely complex engineering, could not conceive how anyone could afford to create so much and so fast without sacrificing quality. What Ford was doing did not fit the worldview of German intelligence. The Reich believed in technical perfection, and in Germany, where the production process was personalized and unique, the idea of mass manufacturing was seen as something vulgar, intended for simple industrial products. The fact that Ford was able to create a war machine of the magnitude of the B-24, made up of 1.5 million parts and assembled in less than 24 hours, was an affront to its view of war as an engineering art. For the Germans, this idea of production represented the destruction of everything that was worthy in a war machine. However, the mathematics of the American production system could not be ignored any longer. The production of airplanes on the scale of the United States was not a coincidence. It was an elaborate strategy that involved applying an industrial philosophy radically different from that of the Nazis. American war production depended not on a network of specialized engineers, but on a coordinated system where tasks were systematically fragmented and delegated to ordinary workers, turning them into essential pieces of the production puzzle. In the United States, strength was in quantity, organization and repetition, and this was a concept radically alien to the military and ideological mentality of Germany. However, What was most shocking to the German leadership was not only the scale of American production, but its constancy. American plants, including Willow Run, could alter their methods and adapt to new requirements with a flexibility that no plant in Germany could emulate. When the Americans began mass-producing the B-24, the production rate skyrocketed. At its peak, one aircraft rolled off the assembly line every hour. For German engineers, this was a statistic impossible to conceive. But most ironic of all, even though statistics about American production were being revealed by spies, intercepted documents, and reliable sources, there was still an internal refusal to accept reality. Ideological blindness was the real obstacle. The idea that Germany could be surpassed not only in numbers but in logistical and production capacity was inconceivable. The mathematics that governed warfare was changing, and no one, not even the most perceptive, wanted to accept that mass production could be the key to victory. And as American factories moved forward, creating a virtually unbeatable war machine, the theory of Aryanism and Nazi ideology were challenged by the reality of numbers itself. In the next part, we will see how the German High Command, in its reluctance, ignored these crucial facts to the point that it could no longer react. And resistance to accepting the truth about American production would have devastating consequences for the Reich. In a dark room of a hidden building in Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris watched something that would change the course of the war. The film, which was secretly handed to him by a Swiss intelligence agent, was no longer one of those empty reports or abstract documents that often arrived at his office. It was irrefutable proof. At 24 frames per second, the truth appeared before his eyes. The Ford Willow Run assembly line in full operation. With each scene, the American precision became more evident. Workers, men and women, blacks, whites, immigrants, performed their tasks with near-perfect coordination. Parts of the B-24 Liberators moved through the factory, converging to assemble one of the most powerful bombers in the world, with an efficiency that seemed to defy all engineering conventions. The film didn't just show the production, it captured the rhythm of the American machine, where the constant was the speed of manufacturing, the unbeatable system that was transforming the balance of world industrial power, the fluid movement of the parts, the meticulous fitting of the structures, and finally the complete airplane rolling off the assembly line. All of this was recorded, as if it were a dance of metal parts and organized men. It was not a myth, it was pure reality. However, at the end of the projection, Canaris found no comfort in the revelation. Instead, the weight of truth crushed him. He knew that this visual proof, a piece as strong as any report or physical evidence, would not be enough to convince Reich leaders, not at such a critical moment in the war. He knew that by presenting these images to Hitler, he would not only face blind denial, but also the charge of treason. The ideology, so deeply rooted in the hearts and minds of the Nazis, was stronger than any evidence. The film would not reach Hitler. It would be nothing more than his own hands. Canaris, in an act of desperation and resignation, burned the roll of film. The fire that consumed the images was more than a simple destruction of evidence. It was the symbolic death of any chance to convince Nazi leaders of American logistical and industrial superiority. The film showed what the Germans refused to see. The United States, with its fully functioning factories, was producing planes at a pace that could eventually dominate the skies of Europe. But the ideological blindness that dominated the German command made it impossible for any officer, no matter how rational, to accept such a reality. It wasn't just a failure to recognize the numbers. It was a deliberate refusal to accept the truth. Canaris knew what was at stake. He was faced with a moral and strategic dilemma, a truth that could save the Reich but which, when revealed, would condemn him. He knew that the time to act had passed. The mentality that reigned in Berlin was now irremediable. Denial had become the basis of all military decisions. The film was proof of what the Americans were achieving, but instead of an appeal, it became a ticking time bomb. The very existence of this evidence would create an inverse effect. Instead of a confrontation with reality, he would only face the hostility of the Nazi authorities. And so, with a heavy sigh, Canaris destroyed what could have been the last thread of hope to save the Reich from its own destruction. The bomber factory, larger than a few entire cities, would remain, for the Nazi high command, a myth, an American propaganda. In the next part, we will see how refusing to accept reality would lead to the creation of one of the greatest strategic failures in military history, Plans to invade the Soviet Union would be carried out without regard to the enemy's true strength. But the impact of denial would extend beyond the simple loss of a battle. The economic war was being won by those who no one believed they could win. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was the only member of the Nazi top brass with a solid industrial background. While the other leaders clung to ideology and pure rhetoric, Speer understood the reality of numbers and output. So when he finally had access to the confidential reports on airplane production in the United States, he didn't just see a statistic, he saw the end of the Reich. In his diary, he noted ruefully, "If these figures are true, we do not face defeat. We face annihilation." What he was reading was, in reality, the collapse of any strategy that depended on German technical superiority. American production was not only larger, she was countless. At that time, the numbers were clear and terrifying. American bomber production outnumbered German aircraft production by a ratio of 10 to 1, while German factories, heavily dependent on a skilled workforce, struggled to maintain a fairly constant production line. U.S. factories, with their massive industrial mobilization and unlimited resources, were producing more bombers than the Luftwaffe could destroy. For Speer, a man who deeply understood the power of machines and factories, these numbers represented a technical collapse and, perhaps even more so, a moral bankruptcy of the Nazi leadership. The production of bombers like the B-24 was not just quantitative, it was also qualitative. Each American aircraft was built with a level of precision that the Germans, with their handcrafted models and expensive production, could not even dream of achieving. By 1944, the United States was producing more than 18,000 B-24, B-17, and other fighter aircraft. This meant a monthly production of more than 1,400 aircraft, an amount that exceeded Germany's entire annual aircraft production. American bomber production was 10 times greater than Germany's. For Speer, this was not only a strategic advantage but an imminent defeat. Unbelievable, isn't it? If this surprised you, comment below with absolute power, because in terms of production, American military strength was getting absolute. And what shocked Speer most was not just the number of planes, but the speed with which those numbers multiplied. In a war where time was an invisible enemy, the ability to produce more than the enemy could destroy, steadily and predictably, meant that victory was not just being planned, it was already in production. While Speer understood the magnitude of this reality, the reaction in the German high command was one of total denial. Göring, with his characteristic arrogance, ridiculed early estimates of American production. Americans only know how to make refrigerators and automobiles. How could they be producing bombers in such numbers? He declared, with cynical laughter. For Göring, the theory of American mass production did not make sense. How could such a disorganized and racially mixed people be able to overcome the superior ingenuity of Germany, where production was precise, technical, and above all dignified? Göring's rejection of reality was not a failure of vision, but a reflection of his deep belief that the Aryan order would prevail over any other model. The irony of it all is that, by ignoring the true strength of American production, the Nazis were practically giving away the war. While Speer acknowledged, coolly and logically, that Germany was losing its ability to produce aircraft efficiently, Hitler's leadership clung to an ideology of racial purity that prevented them from seeing the real battle being fought in America's factories. The production capacity, the use of diverse labor, and the incredible logistical system of the United States were victories invisible to the Reich, but extremely visible to any sensible observer. Speer had no doubts about the numbers. However, he knew that if he accepted the truth and reported it directly to Hitler, his position would be compromised, if not fatally destroyed. And this is due to the fact that in a regime where ideology overcame pragmatism, and where any sign of defeatism was immediately punished, revealing this truth could be interpreted as a betrayal. Speer was caught between his technical knowledge and the empire of lies created by Nazi leaders. The math was clear, but ideology drowned out logic. Germany's greatest strategic mistake, therefore, was not a military miscalculation, but an ideological miscalculation. While Speer contemplated the impending disaster, the Nazi leadership was busy with its military and racial obsessions, unable to comprehend that the war would not be won with more weapons or with more men. It would be decided by the ability to produce more, and the United States was already producing enough to ensure that Germany was irreversibly outpaced. As much as German intelligence had access to hard data, And as much as American production was documented and confirmed by reliable sources, senior Reich officials could not accept the truth. They could not admit that the superior order of their military could not compete with the flexibility and manpower of American factories. This meant that, even with all the evidence, the Reich was condemning itself to a war of attrition that it could never win. And so while Speer kept the harsh reality of the numbers to himself, the Reich prepared for new attacks, with a strategy that not only ignored the real risks, but amplified them. In the next part, we will see how the concept of mass production was not only a key to the U.S. victory, but how it transformed air warfare irreversibly, leading Germany into a spiral of logistical and tactical failures. In February 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched the so-called Operation Argument, a devastating attack that would signal the end of any doubts about American industrial supremacy. For the first time, more than 1,000 American bombers flew together over enemy territory, a number that exceeded the Luftwaffe's ability to respond. Many of these planes had been produced at Willow Run, and now, with their powerful engines and stout wings, they were about to make reality finally impose itself on the Reich, not by words or statistics, but by explosions. As American planes crisscrossed the skies over Germany, their bombs fell on a carefully planned target, the industrial complexes that fed the Nazi war machine. The impact was not only physical, but strategic. What Göring, in his arrogance, had called propaganda, was now a destructive reality. The factory that he had claimed was a myth, that he had dismissed as part of the American fantasy, was destroying the Reich. The operation was a decisive milestone, not only because of the magnitude of the attack, but because of the clarity with which it revealed the fatal flaw of German intelligence, the underestimation of the American ability to produce bombers on such a scale. Airplanes that were once despised as toys or implausible inventions were now the main threat to the Nazi Empire. The Luftwaffe, which had previously dominated the skies, was now unable to muster an effective defense. Germany's response was completely inadequate. The number of fighters available to protect the homeland was minuscule compared to the number of American bombers flying over Europe. Germany's aircraft production lines, which were already overstretched and declining, could not compete with the firepower of U.S. production, which continued to grow exponentially. As bombs fell on factories and industrial centers, Luftwaffe generals began to realize that the real strength lay not in secret weapon systems or technological innovations like V-2 rockets, but in mass production capabilities. The enemy was not weak, he was not bankrupt, he was not burdened by internal crises. The enemy was actually faster. The American economy, far from being disorganized or failure, was producing on a scale that exceeded any expectations. The United States was arming its planes like an assembly line, constantly, quickly, and efficiently, and this made the German war effort, as innovative and creative as it was, irrelevant in the face of the strength of production. The Nazis' miscalculation now became irrefutable. They had focused on attacking with precision, on creating complex and sophisticated weapons, but what they failed to see was that in an all-out war, the ability to manufacture not just one but thousands of units was the real key to victory. And while Germany clung to its idea of technical superiority, the United States was attacking en masse, with an unparalleled organization. By January 1944, production of B-24s had exceeded 650 planes per month, a rate that left the Luftwaffe's efforts in a desperate state. The simple concept of mass production, with systems that the Germans considered inhumane and inefficient, was now consuming Germany's arms and ammunition factories. And all this happened without Germany realizing that it was already lost. By the time American bombers reached the skies over Germany, Nazi leaders had already squandered precious opportunities to adapt to the new reality. Göring, in his arrogance, continued to laugh at what he considered American weakness, while Speer, the only one who understood the data and figures, found himself unable to do anything to alter the course of a war that was already being decided on the American factory floor. The air raid of February 1944 was only the beginning of a sequence of events that would gradually weaken Germany until it was inevitable. The reality that the United States could produce more bombers than Germany could shoot down would become increasingly clear, not only to the military but also to the civilian population. American air supremacy was not only being built on the assembly line, but also on the data that German officials refused to accept. Combat aircraft, which had previously been seen as a reflection of German military strength, were now outclassed by an enemy that produced non-stop, with a capability that could never be matched. The simple fact that American production is faster, more efficient, and more adaptable proved decisive. What the Germans could not see was that the war was no longer won with cutting-edge engineering alone, but with logistics, organization, and industrial capacity. Every American bomber that took off, every unit produced, was a reminder that victory in war no longer depended solely on the skill of troops or technological innovation, but on the ability of an entire country to work in unison, producing a massive amount of resources and equipment. And this, for the Nazi leadership, was unacceptable, a true affront to the idea that a superior empire could be overcome by a weak people. War for the United States became a matter of quantity, and that was a lesson the Nazis would never learn in time. The miscalculation was now as evident as the explosions that razed the factories in the heart of Germany. And as the Reich tried to cope with the impact of the air raids, the statistics that Canaris, Speer, and others had tried to hide from the Nazi leadership were beginning to materialize on the battlefield. But the real impact of what was happening in American factories and in the skies of Europe was far from over. The February 1944 attacks were just the beginning. As the Allies intensified their offensives, a new revelation was preparing to further change the tide of the war. In the next part, we will see how the United States' escalation of production not only strengthened its air position, but also condemned Germany to inefficiency, and how the Reich continued to deny its own destruction. By 1944, the air war over Europe was rapidly turning into a nightmare for the Luftwaffe. Reports from German Air Force pilots, such as the legendary Adolf Galland, described the astonishment and helplessness that took over the skies in the face of the new reality of American aviation. For the first time, more than 800 B-17 and B-24 bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force flew in joint formation over German territory. For the Luftwaffe, this was a terrifying sight. The number of bombers flying side by side, in a massive formation, was something never seen before. Not just the number of aircraft, but the precision with which they flew, protected by P-51 Mustang fighters that formed an impenetrable shield around the bombers. For the Germans, who were used to facing smaller, less protected bomber formations, the contrast was striking. The difference in scale and firepower was brutal. When Luftwaffe pilots attempted to intercept these bombers, they quickly discovered that the task was impossible, not only because of the immense number of planes, but because of the quality of the escort that accompanied each formation. The P-51 Mustangs, which had been perfected to protect the bombers to their targets, demonstrated an air superiority that nullified any attempt by German fighters to attack. For Luftwaffe pilots, the feeling of being outnumbered and technically disadvantaged was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, which had once set the pace of the air war, now found itself reduced to powerless spectators. This was the culmination of a systemic failure. The Luftwaffe did not have enough fighters to intercept even half of the bombers that were now flying over Germany. In a desperate attempt to react, German commanders began to mobilize their combat units into squadrons, but even in large numbers, they were overwhelmed by the incredible American logistical capacity. Germany, which had specialized in tactics of precision and complexity, could no longer compete with the abundance of resources that the United States had fielded. What was once considered an efficient model of warfare, based on the technical skill of pilots and aircraft, was now weakened by the lack of numbers. American bombers were not just aircraft. They were war machines that embodied the strength of American industrial production. With more than 1,400 planes produced per month, the Luftwaffe faced an impossible task: to prevent the onslaught of an overwhelming number of fighter-protected bombers that surpassed anything Germany could offer. The calculus, which had once favored Luftwaffe air tactics, was now crumbling in the face of the reality of mass production that turned air warfare into a numbers game. The tactical doctrine that the Luftwaffe had perfected, based on quick and direct attacks, was no longer sufficient to counter the immense industrial power that the United States had set in motion. But the collapse was not instantaneous. The first signs of German impotence arrived slowly, as a gradual loss of air territory. The Luftwaffe, once a feared force, now saw its ability to control the sky being progressively nullified. The technical skill of the German pilots or the precision of the bombs dropped by their aircraft was no longer enough. Air superiority was becoming a matter of logistical capacity, of resources, of quantity. and the United States was winning this battle with an ease that the Germans refused to accept. One of the most dramatic moments of this change in air dynamics occurred during one of the largest raids by the 8th Air Force. More than 800 American bombers, escorted by hundreds of P-51 fighters, were flying over enemy lines with the sole purpose of destroying German arms and aircraft factories, destroying the industrial base that supported the war effort. And although the Luftwaffe launched a significant number of fighters, the difference in production speed and operating efficiency was devastating. While the Americans were already sending out bombers en masse, the Luftwaffe still relied on tactics that had been effective at the start of the war, but now seemed antiquated in the face of the new reality. The sight of thousands of aircraft flying in compact formation over the heart of Germany was more than a spectacle. It was the reflection of a new war, where logistics and production capacity were now the biggest factors of victory. This paradigm shift was not just a blow to the Luftwaffe. It was a painful realization that modern warfare would not be won with the complexity of advanced weapons and technologies, but with the ability to produce and sustain a war effort on a scale never seen before. And the United States was doing it, and it was doing it unstoppably. To the Nazi leadership, it was the revelation of a fatal mistake, a mistake that, while it could have been avoided at first, now seemed irreparable. But the reaction of the Nazi commanders was not one of surrender. Instead, they began to intensify defensive strategies and launch more fighters and more fighter planes to try to maintain some air advantage. But time was against them. Meanwhile, American production was only increasing. In the next part, we will see how the intensity of these attacks and the failure to grasp the true capability of the United States would lead Germany into a final battle. A battle not just in the sky, but in the heart of its factories and industries. The Reich, unable to adapt to the new reality, found itself increasingly surrounded. The Willow Run plant in the heart of Michigan State wasn't just a manufacturing hub. It was a factory city, designed for a single purpose: to win the war with the power of its industrial production. With 3.5 million square feet of built area, the Willow Run facility was so large that it could accommodate almost all of Germany's military output in a single space. The magnitude of the factory was incomprehensible to many, even to spies who had infiltrated to uncover the secrets of the American war effort. But what they found were not mysterious secrets or advanced technology hidden in the shadows. What the spies discovered was a gigantic efficiency machine, where every piece of metal, every piece of aluminum, every rivet, and every worker was coordinated with unbeatable precision. In terms of energy consumption, Willow Run consumed more than 2.5 million kilowatt per month. That number in itself was a demonstration of power. To compare, the energy consumption of the entire city of Detroit in 1944 was lower than that of Willow Run. The operation of 1,600 machine tools operating on a continuous basis required a colossal infrastructure, one that not only fed the factory, but kept production ramped up in relentless rotation. Each of these machines, designed to perform specific functions in the assembly of the B-24, ran non-stop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a continuous cycle that challenged the notion of industrial limits. What the Germans never fully understood was that the power of the United States lay not in concealing its capabilities, but in operating them so intensely and steadily that the mere fact of seeing them in action was unbelievable. America did not depend on occult engineers or mysterious methods. There was no trick involved. Rather, it was the combined efficiency of production, coordination, and logistics that created formidable power. Even when German spies managed to gain access to internal areas of Willow Run, they saw the factory working clearly and openly, but the scale of operation was so large, so impressive, that even they couldn't believe their eyes. The mass production of the B-24 bombers was the result of a system where the final piece was just a combination of hundreds of subassemblies produced in different parts of the United States. In fact, Ford created a production model that was practically unbeatable. In a continuous flow operation, the parts of each bomber arrived, separated and packed, from all parts of the country, ready to connect like clockwork. Each worker had a specific function, no more than a single task repeated but performed with precision and speed. Factories were not just places of production. They were interconnected cities, where communications between sections and between factories were maintained quickly and efficiently, allowing any errors to be corrected the moment they arose. This speed and precision made the factories of the United States almost unbeatable. The German spies, in reporting the enormity of Willow Run and the operations taking place there, were faced with a disconcerting reality. The ability to produce a bomber every 63 minutes was not a gimmick. It was not a propaganda invention. It was a raw reality. And even when the spies tried to get the reports to the Reich leadership, few could believe that something so simple, so linear, could be the deciding factor in the war. The idea of mass production efficiently and quickly was not something that fit the calculations of the German top brass, who believed that Germany's strength was based on the technical skill of its engineers and the racial purity of its population. They failed to understand that in the case of modern warfare, the real strength lay in the ability to produce quickly and on a large scale. And this was something that, until then, the United States had done with astonishing efficiency. While German intelligence gathered data and images that confirmed the magnitude of the operation at Willow Run, it found itself unable to correctly interpret these facts. Even as spies reported details about the speed of production, the transportation systems used to distribute parts and materials, and the growing numbers of bombers, the Nazis refused to see the reality. This did not mean a failure of information gathering. It meant an ideological failing, the belief that Germany, with its approach centered on individual effort and technical skill, could still compete with a society capable of operating as a collective war machine. This is where the irony becomes even more evident. U.S. industrial superiority was not based on hiding its secrets, but on an ability to produce more, faster, and more efficiently. Even without mysteries or secret innovations, U.S. factories such as Willow Run were building more bombers than Germany could destroy, with an overwhelming number of planes produced that made any attempt at German defense an untenable task. The American war machine was in full swing, fueled by a logistical network that no one, not even the most informed spies, could fully understand. And so, production continued to grow. Each month, more bombers rolled off the assembly lines. Each month, the numbers of aircraft produced in the United States increased in ways that the Luftwaffe and the Reich itself simply could not keep up with. This reality became increasingly untenable for the Germans, who, despite having all the information, continued to deny the truth. Willow Run and its sister factories, with their logistical and technological might, were creating an inevitable future for the Reich. Victory, which seemed within Germany's reach in 1940, was already out of their hands. In the next segment, we will see how the underestimation of American production capacity finally reached the point of no return. The war would no longer be decided on the battlefield but in the factories, and whoever was producing more and faster would win the war. Inside the sprawling Willow Run plant, 42,000 workers were engaged in the relentless production of B-24 bombers. The number alone was impressive. But on closer look, what Germans would find if they had dared to look was a reflection of everything they despised: diversity, inclusion, and a workforce that was the very antithesis of the Reich. Of the 42,000 workers, more than 11,000 were women. For many, this was an unthinkable statistic. The Nazi mentality, which believed in the superiority of men and the subordination of women to the home, could not accept the idea that these women were producing the greatest military force in history. In addition, nearly 4,000 of the workers were African Americans, part of a historically marginalized population who, according to the racial ideology of the Third Reich, should be unable to contribute meaningfully to any great or noble endeavor. But it was not only that. About 1/200 of the workers had physical disabilities, a trait that the Nazis considered a burden on society, but which in the American industrial machine was transformed into an essential workforce. The fact that a factory could operate with such diversity and achieve unprecedented levels of efficiency seemed like a moral and industrial revolution that the Nazis could not even imagine. For the Nazi leadership, all of this was a fundamental contradiction. The idea that racial and social diversity could be a driver of productivity was beyond comprehension. For the Nazis, a strong society should be homogeneous, rigidly hierarchical, with each group fulfilling a specific role. However, the real force behind the American war machine was not racial purity or rigid hierarchy, but the uniting of different people and cultures around a single goal. The production of B-24 bombers, on their monstrous scale, depended on an immense workforce made up of different races, genders, and abilities. This was not a weakness, but the greatest show of strength that Germany could ever produce. Nazi racial ideology, with its belief in exclusionary labor, failed to understand how inclusion could be the key to industrial success. For the German leadership, a black man, a woman, or a person with a disability should not be able to operate sophisticated machinery or manufacture warplanes. They believed that only the effort of a superior race could result in such productive power, and yet the United States was proving just the opposite. American factories were taking advantage of all the human resources at their disposal, without regard to skin color, gender, or physical condition. This social and logistical flexibility allowed aircraft production to remain on a scale unimaginable to the Nazi mentality. It is at this point that the story of Willow Run reaches its apex of irony. The diversity of its workforce was what sustained the war effort, while Germany's racial purity and rigid hierarchy were literally destroying its own ability to fight. Every woman, every African American, every disabled worker, every person the Nazis despised or neglected was contributing to the defeat of the Third Reich. What the Nazis saw as weakness became, in reality, the greatest logistical force of the war. What this really meant for the German leadership was an existential question. How could the Americans, the nation they saw as decadent and racially corrupt, surpass the Reich in terms of war-making, when, for the Nazis, the key to success lay not in working together, but in maintaining a rigid order, a purity? Not only was the American war machine operating more efficiently due to its monumental scale, but it was also doing so in a way that was based on the idea that collectivity and inclusion could be stronger than exclusion. It wasn't just the strength of American production that was winning, it was the moral force behind it. The power of its industrial system was in the hands of those who were considered inferior by the Nazi regime. And as the Nazis continued to nurture their racist view of war and society, reality was being built in the hangars of Willow Run, where factory workers of all colors, genders, and abilities were creating airplanes and weapons with an efficiency that was impossible to beat. The U.S. was not only winning on the battlefield, but it was doing so with a model that broke the entire ideological logic of the Reich. War was no longer a matter of military strength or technical superiority. The war was now being won by human and organizational efficiency, and the Nazis didn't know how to respond to that. Factual moment. In 1944, the U.S. was producing about 18,000 fighter planes a year, while Germany, with its entire war machine, was producing about 9,000 in the same period. American production was twice as large as Germany's, even facing a war on two continents. If you were surprised by this statistic, comment below with "Logistics wins," because this was the naked truth that the Nazis refused to face. And as Germany clung to its bankrupt ideology, America's greatest weapon, not the might of its weapons but the ability to produce non-stop, efficiently, and inclusively, was slowly destroying the heart of the Reich. The war, as the Nazis knew it, was already lost. But while they were still immersed in their ideological blindness, American production, unbeatable and unstoppable, continued to advance. In the next chapter, we will see how Germany could no longer ignore this truth, and how the inability to adapt its tactics to the new industrial landscape meant that the Nazis missed the last chance to turn the war around. At a critical meeting in early 1944, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, with a grave expression, handed Hermann Göring a set of irrefutable proofs: aerial photographs, intercepted intelligence reports, and transcripts of conversations that demonstrated the enormous production capacity of the United States, especially the operation of Willow Run, the largest aircraft factory in the world. The information was clear. The Americans were producing more bombers than the Luftwaffe could shoot down, at a rate that put the Reich in an untenable position. The evidence was not just quantitative, it was qualitative. Canaris knew it wasn't a propaganda game. It was a technical reality that was crushing the possibility of victory for Germany. But in presenting the documents, he knew he was not handing over the truth to a man open to logic, but rather to an officer obsessed with ideology. Göring, with his arrogant demeanor, picked up the documents, flipped through them nonchalantly, and then laughed aloud. He looked at Canaris with a cynical smile and said, "Do you think airplanes are made like sausages?" The phrase, spoken with disdain, was a clear response to the scale of American production that Canaris had shown him. For Göring, the idea that airplanes could be mass-manufactured so quickly and efficiently was simply inconceivable. He did not believe that a war bomber, such a complex machine of destruction, could be produced automatically as part of an assembly line. For him, Mass production was not worthy of a superior nation. The vision of war of Göring and many other Nazis was firmly rooted in aristocratic and hierarchical values. For them, the creation of a war machine should be something elaborate, with precision, each piece placed with care, as if they were artisans working on a work of art. Producing on a large scale, horizontally, without the obsession with perfect details in each unit, was unthinkable. It wasn't about individual technical skill or design excellence, all of which Göring and his peers believed were fundamental to military superiority. For him, the American production model was a theatrical invention, something that made no sense in a world where only the great empires, the superior men, could be truly capable of generating power. Göring's response was not a simple contempt for the efficiency of the Americans, but a philosophical rejection of everything that the United States represented in terms of industrial and social production. The Nazi view of war and society could not adjust to the idea of horizontality and repetition. The notion of an industrial model where tasks were delegated to ordinary workers and repeated thousands of times along an assembly line seemed something inferior and completely incompatible with the ideology of the Third Reich. In hierarchical German culture, where roles were rigidly defined and each worker had an immutable position, the idea of allowing anyone, women, blacks, the disabled, to become key cogs in the wheel was a humiliation to the principles of racial purity and authoritarian organization that the Nazis advocated. American society, with its system of inclusion and diversity, completely broke with Göring's worldview. For him, the war should not be won efficiently, but with the concentrated effort of a homogeneous and superior people, guided by the willpower of strong leaders and not by the mobilization of all the citizens of a nation. By completely ignoring the relevance of standardization and mass production, the Nazis were missing the main force of modern warfare. They could not understand that for the United States, war was not about technical perfection or the elaboration of secret plans. It was largely a question of scale, of producing more with fewer errors, of speeding up production so that quantity became an insurmountable advantage. And that was the winning strategy. But for Göring and other Nazi leaders, it was a humiliating strategy. They could not accept that democracy could triumph in a field where hierarchy and racial purity were seen as essential to military force. Göring's miscalculation was profound. He and many others within the Reich were so fixated on the idea that technical efficiency needed to be synonymous with complexity and superiority that they simply failed to realize that the Americans were using simplicity and repetition as weapons in their own war of production. What Göring saw as weakness, the United States saw as strength. The moral force behind American production came not from the uncompromising quality of each individual piece, but from the ability to mobilize human resources on an unprecedented scale, which resulted in quantity and consistency rather than highly specialized work. This refusal to accept the reality of mass production was what ultimately defined the collapse of Nazi strategy. Göring and his peers were stuck in a mentality of exclusivity, while the United States showed that true superiority lay not in who could do the work in the most refined form, but in who could do the most work in a shorter time. It was no longer a war of isolated skill, but of collective power. Meanwhile, the numbers kept increasing. U.S. bomber production continued to grow, and the Luftwaffe, unable to intercept the number of American bombers in a single mission, began to become impractical. Göring's response, based on myths and ideological beliefs, not only delayed the necessary military response but also sealed the fate of the Luftwaffe. In the next part, we will see how the refusal to accept the strength of American production turned into a complete operational failure, when the Nazis, completely disconnected from reality, failed to prevent the final collapse of the war machine. Amid the vastness of Willow Run, the force that underpinned bomber production did not come from monumental heroes or complex military strategies. It came from ordinary people, women, men, immigrants, minorities, and even people with disabilities, who dedicated themselves to a greater cause. Among these people, one story stands out, that of Rosa Munro, one of the women known as Rosie the Riveter. Like many others, Rosa was not an industrial worker before the war. She was a mother, with young children who woke up every morning to get them ready for school. After making sure the house was organized and the children fed, she would put on her apron and head to the factory. There, he exchanged household chores for the operation of a rivet gun, one of the tools used to assemble the wings of B-24 bombers. This was the new rhythm of his life, a transition from menial chores to war chores, from routine gestures to epic actions. But Rosa was not alone. Thousands of women like her, without any previous experience in heavy industries, were turning their daily routines into silent acts of resistance against the Nazi regime. These women, who joined the war effort, were not seen as heroines or propaganda icons. They were for the most part anonymous, doing repetitive, unglamorous work on an endless assembly line. What united them was an invisible force, a common determination to win the war, not on distant battlefields, but in factories and industrial facilities, where their hands worked incessantly to ensure that American industrial power was not just an idea, but an overwhelming reality. Every rivet gun, every nut tightened, every piece of aluminum cut and fitted was a step toward the end of Nazism. For the United States, it was the war being won on the assembly line, and every worker, no matter how simple his or her role, had a part in this process of destroying the Reich. Each bolt tightened was a contribution to the final victory. What is often forgotten about this part of history is that America's industrial victory was not built by individual heroism, but by a mass of ordinary people performing extraordinary tasks every day. The Rosies, as they were called, were not combatants. They weren't in trenches, they weren't flying bombers. They were doing the invisible but equally crucial work. His hands, calloused by repeated riveting gestures, were building the weapons that would overthrow the might of the Third Reich. For them, the war was not a battle fought in distant fields, but an everyday battle, where every plane that rolled off the assembly line represented a small victory against fascism. These women were, in many ways, the beating heart of the American war machine. His contribution was more than just a matter of numbers. She was an invisible moral force, sustained by the belief that everyone had a role to play in defeating a common enemy. For every woman like Rosa Munro, who not only sacrificed herself to operate the factory machines, but also played an essential role in the emotional sustenance of a nation at war, victory was built on silence, dedication, and collective effort. Many of them worked long hours without any public recognition, away from the cameras and the spotlight. They were the invisible forces that kept the wheels of American war moving. What is most striking, and deeply ironic, is that the Nazi regime itself failed to grasp the moral potency that lurked in this war effort. While Goering focused on building aircraft that were technologically advanced, but could not be produced in sufficient quantity to make a difference, American factories were creating bombers in series, en masse, and without interruption, with the help of a workforce that even German spies could not fully understand. The secret of American success lay not in secret technologies, but in organization, in the ability to include and coordinate the efforts of millions of people to achieve a single goal. While the Nazis believed that the war would be won only with great technological advances and elite engineers, the United States was winning with something simpler: repetition, collaboration, and scale. And the irony of this is that while the United States was operating with this system of mass production, many of these women, like Rosa, were having to overcome their own personal barriers. Women who had never gotten their hands on heavy tools were now part of a gigantic industry. They were turning their domestic routines into military tasks, and what was seen as something trivial, making breakfast, taking care of the children, was now being counterposed with the responsibility of building the weapons that would destroy the enemy. The impact of this was not only military, he was also sociological and cultural. The Rosies and other women operating in factories began to challenge the perception that women's role should be limited to the home. They showed that a nation's workforce did not have to be homogeneous but diverse and inclusive, and that strength was what made the United States unbeatable in the war effort. Factual moment. In 1943, more than 18 million women were working in industries in the United States, an amount of manpower that exceeded that of many entire countries in their armed forces. To the Germans, the mere fact that women were doing such technical work seemed an offense to the traditional model of warfare. Unbelievable, isn't it? Comment below with absolute power if this statistic surprised you. This silent war fought in the factories, far from the front lines, began to make the inevitability of American victory more and more visible. But while this was happening, Germany was still insisting on its antiquated strategies and ideological doubt about the industrial might of the United States. In the next part, we will look at how the Reich's final resistance to mass production was broken, and how the failure to understand the true power of the United States led to its total defeat. In April 1945, as the streets of Berlin were covered in the rubble of an empire that was about to fall apart, Allied officials found a German intelligence report that should never have seen the light of day. The document, dated April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday, was the last gasp of a defeated Germany, a belated acknowledgement of the truth that the Nazis had refused to accept for years. However, even in the face of incontrovertible evidence, the report did not bring relief. On the contrary, he underlined a tragedy. Germany had not lost because of a lack of data, but because it refused to believe the data it had, because it insisted on a fantasy of superiority to the end. The report confirmed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, everything that the spies had warned about since 1943. Willow Run, the largest bomber factory in the world, was producing on an unimaginable scale, more than 650 B-24s monthly, and everything Abwehr officials such as Canaris, Oster, and Ritter had discovered about American production was true. They had tried repeatedly to warn Reich leaders, but their warnings were disregarded or treated as mere enemy propaganda. They risked their careers and in many cases their lives to tell the truth, but the arrogance of the Nazi leadership doomed them. The refusal to believe in American reality has become a fatal mistake. The mathematics of industrial production did not lie, but the Nazi leaders preferred to cling to an ideology that gave them comfort. The reality of an America capable of mass-producing airplanes, with a diverse and dedicated workforce, which the Nazis saw as inferior, did not fit the distorted view the Reich had of how a war should be fought. German intelligence officers, such as Canaris, had collected the data exhaustively. Ritter, who had spent a good part of his life in the United States, understood American industrial efficiency better than anyone else in the Nazi high command. He knew that the war was already lost, but when it came to informing Hitler, the truth became a bitter poison. Canaris and Oster had tried unsuccessfully to convince Nazi leaders that the industrial superiority of the United States was the key to the defeat of the Reich. Their reports and recommendations, however, were systematically ignored. Canaris himself, a figure who risked his life to fight the Nazi regime from within, was eventually executed in 1945 for his daring. The men who were right from the start, who had made the correct calculations and warned about America's unbeatable industrial empire, paid the price for their uncomfortable truth. The tragedy lay not only in the military defeat of a nation, but in the systematic neglect of the truth. Every number, every report that Canaris and his subordinates had sent, was absolutely correct. Willow Run and the American factories, with their incredible production capacity, were the basis of an entirely new war strategy, one that depended not on secret technologies or sophisticated tactics, but on scale. Germany's fatal mistake was that its leaders refused to see beyond their own ideology and acknowledge that modern warfare was being won, not with secret engineering, but with mass production that was inevitable, unbeatable, and, above all, morally imposing. And so, in the end, the German intelligence officers who had tried to warn the Nazi leaders with accurate and truthful data found themselves in silent lament. They were right. Canaris, Oster, Ritter, all had understood the reality, but they could not prevent the Reich from succumbing to ideological blindness. At the last meeting, at which the report was presented to Allied leaders, it became clear that American industrial production was never a matter of hiding secrets, but of operating efficiently on a monumental scale, with an inclusive and adaptable workforce, capable of producing more bombers than the Luftwaffe could shoot down. The number of U.S.-produced bombers already exceeded the capabilities of Germany's military machine, and like an avalanche, U.S. production continued to swallow up the resistance of the Reich, and it was only when Germany was already in ruins that the Nazi leadership was finally forced to confront the truth. But it was too late. Factual moment. The United States' wartime production of planes was more than twice as high as Germany's production of planes, with about 18,000 bombers and fighters produced annually, while Germany did not even reach the 9,000 mark in a year. Shocking data, isn't it? If this surprised you, comment "Logistics wins" below to show your support and understand more about how the power of production won the war. The final report that the Allies found was a posthumous confirmation of a truth that was already clear from the beginning. But as the Allies celebrated the victory, the tragedy of a Germany blind to reality continued to echo in the ruins of Berlin. And while American production numbers continued to rise, the Nazis were stuck with their beliefs until the last moment, refusing to see the truth until it was irreversible. In the next part, we will see how, even after the defeat, the idea of racial and ideological superiority continued to influence Germany's strategic choices, but ultimately, it would be logistical incompetence itself that would seal the Reich's fate. By 1943, the war was already lost for Germany, but the Nazi leadership refused to accept the verdict of American production. The military apparatus of the Reich, in its ideological blindness, continued to weave strategies based on false premises, ignoring the objective data that were already before them. The numbers were relentless. While Ford's factories produced 650 B-24 bombers a month, Germany was still mired in artisanal airplane production, lacking the ability to compete in volume. Germany's focus on miracle weapons like the V-2 rocket, which reached a limited production amount, diverted crucial resources that could have been better allocated to expanding its own industrial capacity. But this was not just a technical failure. It was a systemic failure. The Reich, at the height of its strength, was sabotaging itself. There was no more room for flexibility. The Nazi power structure was based on an ideology that punished those who told the truth and rewarded those who fed the myth. The myth of German superiority had infiltrated every aspect of the regime, including its strategic choices. Nazi leaders, stuck in their belief that quality would always trump quantity, continued to invest limited resources in weaponry and secret technology, believing that superweapons could be a game changer. They neglected the production of large-scale fighter planes, where the United States was already creating a superiority that was impossible to ignore. For Germany, the only way to win was through innovation, but that innovation, rather than being applied to mass production, focused on weapons that were not producible in sufficient quantity to have a strategic impact. The failure to realize this, to recognize that modern warfare would not be won with state-of-the-art armaments but with the ability to produce on a large scale, led the Reich to a collapse of perspective. The irony of this tragedy is profound. The war was already lost by the time German spies brought back the reports on Willow Run in 1943, revealing the monstrous production power of the United States. But as much as Canaris, Oster, and Ritter tried to warn their superiors, ideological blindness continued to prevail. Truth was punished, while myths were cultivated. Hitler's regime was not defeated by a lack of data, but by a refusal to accept the truth. The Nazis were so caught up in their distorted view of the world, so convinced that only technical and military superiority would lead to victory, that they failed to see what was happening before their eyes. The United States was producing in quantity and efficiently, while Germany, in its obsession with miracle weapons and complex innovations, was falling behind. The Nazi power structure, dominated by men like Göring and Speer, was not interested in listening to those who tried to bring a more realistic view. When Canaris and Oster arrived with their detailed intelligence reports, showing just how vulnerable the Reich really was in relation to American war production, the response was always the same: laughter, disdain, and disbelief. Germany was losing the war not just because U.S. production capacity was inevitable, but because its leaders were more focused on feeding their own mythology than on confronting the harsh reality of logistics. They continued to ignore mathematics and American industrial power, preferring to create false hopes with superweapons, while the enemy was churning out bombers and fighters at a rate that made any German defensive effort untenable. This historical tragedy was not only caused by a lack of technical vision, but by an inability to accept the social and economic changes that were shaping the modern world. The power of mass production, the engine of American industrial capitalism, was simply something that the Nazi regime could not comprehend. The American workforce, with its diversity, was producing on a scale that Germany could never imitate. Men and women of all races, backgrounds, and physical conditions were contributing to the defeat of the Reich, and this the Nazis saw as a weakness. In fact, it was the greatest fortress of all, the ability to mobilize and coordinate an entire nation for a single goal: to win the war. What the Reich did not realize until was that the real war was no longer fought only on the battlefield. The logistical war was being won on the assembly line, where the mass production of planes, tanks, and armaments was becoming the real battlefield. The abundance of resources of the United States, its organization and efficiency in all aspects of military production, were consuming Germany from within. Even Germany's most brilliant military strategies could not compete with the ease of production of the United States. As much as the Luftwaffe tried to respond with its fighters and bombers, the number of American planes became an impossible number to deal with, and by the time the war reached its climax in 1944 and 1945, Germany was exhausted, without sufficient resources to sustain its military capability. The U.S. victory in the production war was absolutely consolidated, and the German strategy was completely dismantled by the American industrial power. The war was already lost long before Berlin fell, but no one had the courage to accept it. The last days of the Reich were a dance of desperate efforts to keep alive a vision that was dead on paper. The data were in front of them, clear and relentless. But the fatal miscalculation was not a collection failure. It was a failure of acceptance. The refusal to understand that American productivity had already won the war was, ironically, what sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Fact point. By the time the war ended, the United States had produced more than 33,000 combat aircraft during the conflict, while Germany had produced just over 90,000 aircraft, a difference that proved decisive in recent air offensives. These figures prove that, despite the superior technique of some German models, mass production and logistics were the keys to victory. If this surprised you, comment below "logistics wins" to support the analysis of the numbers. Germany did not lose for lack of accurate data, but for rejecting data that did not fit its fantasy of superiority. In the next part, we will see how the consequences of this ideological blindness not only destroyed the Reich, but also redefined the nature of modern warfare, where the ability to produce faster than the enemy became the biggest deciding factor. Numbers, which are often considered cold and impersonal throughout World War II, took on a moral and philosophical dimension. The United States produced 18,000 B-24 bombers, 12,000 B-17s, and more than 86,000 aircraft in the year 1944. To put this in perspective, Germany, over the entire duration of the war, produced 94,000 planes. In purely quantitative terms, the difference was immense. The air power of the United States surpassed that of Germany with overwhelming ease. But behind these numbers was something far more significant, a quiet, profound response to the ideological arrogance of the Reich, which insisted that its racial and technical superiority would be the key to winning the war. Each plane produced at Willow Run was not just another war machine. It was a moral affirmation, an act of silent resistance against a worldview that was based on exclusion, racial supremacy, and ideological purity. The U.S. war effort was much more than a matter of mass production. He was a response, tacit and invisible, to the whole dogma that the Third Reich preached. While Germany invested in secret technologies and superweapons such as the V-2 rocket, believing that technical superiority was the key to victory, the United States was winning with something much simpler but unavoidable: efficiency, diversity, and collective work. Every plane produced on the assembly lines, every bomber that came out of Willow Run was a small moral victory. It was as if every rivet and every piece of metal assembled was a silent affirmation that the strength of democracy and inclusion could overcome the obscurity of racist ideology. The Willow Run factory, far from being a simple industrial complex, has become a symbol of resistance to hatred. When the Nazis ridiculed the racial and social diversity of the United States, when they said that women, blacks, immigrants, and the disabled were incapable of contributing to the war effort, the numbers showed that the collective work and strength of a united country was more powerful than any exclusionary worldview. The heroes of Willow Run were not men and women armed with pistols and grenades, but with tools, courage, and a sense of duty. They were fighting the war in silence, and every step up the assembly line was an act of historical justice. It wasn't just the ability to produce more bombers that made the difference. It was the nature of mass production. Every plane built, every component produced, came from a system that excluded no one. On the contrary, it embraced everyone. Working men and women, white and black, with or without physical disabilities, all were united in a common effort to overcome evil. In contrast to the Nazi vision of a divided world, with rigid hierarchies and racial supremacy, American effectiveness came from its ability to bring people together, to mobilize all sectors of society. The math of success was not just in quantity, but in process. Inclusion and collective work were the most powerful tools for defeating Nazi mythology. While Germany continued to cultivate myths of racial superiority, Reality was being created on the Willow Run assembly line. Every production issue, every bomber, every plane represented a victory against an ideology that preached division, while the United States proved that true strength came from the unity and collaboration of all. When the Nazis saw American workers, with their diversity, as weak, they were ignoring the strength of a nation united by the common goal of ending fascism. Mathematics was stronger than mythology. The real tragedy for Germany was that it got lost in its own narrow and distorted view of the world. Throughout the war, Nazi leaders were blind to the moral force that lurked behind America's production figures. The refusal to accept the truth was one of the Reich's greatest strategic failures. By the time the numbers began to pile up, 18,000 B-24s, 12,000 B-17s, and planes began to dominate the skies over Europe, it was clear that America's industrial superiority had already secured victory. But Germany, by insisting on exclusive systems and secret weapons, has lost the ability to react to this power. The failure was not technical, it was systemic, a failure of leadership, a failure of vision. In the next part, we will look at how Germany's latest desperate efforts to change the course of the war by focusing on superweapons and covert technologies proved futile against the reality of U.S. mass production. The war, as was already clear, would not be won by the most advanced technological inventions, but by the capacity of production. Mathematical truth, a truth that the Nazis refused to accept until the last moment, would finally be the one that would seal the fate of the Reich. Decades after the end of the war, at a tribute ceremony at Willow Run, the truth of a distant past met with the reflection of the present. Rosa Monroe, the former Rosie the Riveter, who during the war years operated a rivet gun on the factory's assembly lines, now stood before a figure from the past who represented the enemy side. Hans Rudel, the former Luftwaffe pilot, known for being one of Germany's most decorated aviators, was among the guests. They met in the same land that had once been one of the greatest symbols of industrial warfare, a battlefield on which both, in very different ways, were involved. Rudel, now old and tired, looked at Rosa and asked, with a curiosity that only the experience of a warrior could carry, "How did you build so many?" The question was simple, but loaded with tacit admission. He, a war veteran, someone who had lived at the center of a seemingly invincible war machine, could not understand how the nation he and his compatriots saw as inferior in the 1940s could have surpassed Germany in terms of industrial output. Rosa's answer, full of simplicity and wisdom, echoed as the synthesis of the whole story that had happened. "We just went to work every day and did what needed to be done." The response, a testament to a collective and unglamorous effort, was more powerful than any technical explanation or battle report. It was the essence of American victory, not by brute force or grand heroic gestures, but by the ethics of everyday life, by the quiet dedication of millions of people who, together, created an unbeatable force. This phrase by Rosa Monroe not only encapsulated the industrial power that had ensured the Allied victory, but it also reflected the moral superiority that American democracy represented, even with all its defects and limitations. Germany had lost itself in an ideal of supremacy, in an idea that racial purity and intellectual elite were the only ways to achieve greatness. On the other hand, the United States, with all its contradictions and imperfections, demonstrated that the real strength lay in mobilizing all citizens and doing all kinds of work, no matter how simple, with the aim of overcoming the greater evil. Rosa and her co-workers, women and men, who never sought recognition, represented the soul of a nation that believed in the power of joint effort, in the ability to transform every daily task into a contribution to a cause greater than any ideology, the recognition of the enemy, and in this case of Hans Rudel himself, a man who had lived through the war in all its violence and complexity, symbolized not only the acceptance of defeat, but also historical reconciliation. The former Luftwaffe pilot, someone who had been part of the effort to destroy that same democracy, now saw up close the real reason for the defeat. It was not because of the lack of military force, it was not because of the superiority of an overdeveloped technology, but because of the strength of collective work, because of the humanity of everyday life. The United States had won not just with numbers, but with a morale that was reflected in the weary hands of millions of workers, in the sleepless nights of people like Rosa Monroe, who never stopped believing, even in the harshest conditions, that their contribution was essential. What the United States proved was that the daily effort of a free society, united by hard work and dedication to the common good, was more powerful than any mythology of superiority the Reich could imagine. The impact of this moral victory was not limited to the Willow Run assembly line. It was reflected in every aspect of American society, where women, blacks, immigrants, and workers of all backgrounds were playing vital roles. In contrast to Germany, where society was built on a rigid hierarchy, where ideas of purity and exclusivity were seen as fundamental to survival, the United States showed that by including all kinds of people in the fight against fascism, a collective workforce was created, capable of achieving something far greater than any authoritarian empire could achieve. This industrial victory, which seemed almost invisible in its immediate impact, was more than a matter of production capacity. It was an ethical legacy of a country that, for all its challenges, was able to see its citizens as equal assets in a greater cause. Diversity has won over dogma. Collective work overcame racial obsession. Every step of work carried out in the factories, on the assembly lines, in the fields, and in the cities of the United States was a blow against fascism, not with state-of-the-art weapons, but with the force of daily effort, with the awareness that truth and justice, however slow at times, would prevail. The meeting between Rosa Munro and Hans Rudel was not only a moment of personal reflection for them, but also a symbol of a historical truth that for so long had been ignored. The numbers, cold and impersonal, had spoken, and mathematics won. It was not technical superiority or ideological purity that defined war, but the ability to produce, to coordinate, to mobilize all human resources for a single purpose. And this is what ended up defeating not only the Reich, but any concept of greatness based on exclusion and authoritarianism. In the next part, we will see how the post-war world reconfigured itself, and how the lesson of mass production would shape the global order in the following decades, with the overcoming of war not only in the military field, but also in the global mentality that was established from those decisive years. The story of Willow Run and its contribution to the victory of the United States in World War II represents not only the end of an empire, but the definitive defeat of an ideology that was based on the belief that technical and racial superiority could prevail in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The truth that unfolded before the eyes of Hitler and his generals was clear. Democracy, with all its imperfection, proved to be superior, not by brute force, but by collective efficiency, by mobilizing all its citizens, regardless of their color, sex, or origin. The mass production of planes, such as B-24s leaving every 63 minutes from the Willow Run assembly lines, dismantled the idea of a war decided by isolated technology or the military ingenuity of a few men. Germany's ideological failure, which ignored the clear signs of an enemy capable of producing more and faster, was fatal. It was not just a war of tactics and armaments, but a war of logistics. And when Germany did not understand that the volume and production capacity would outpace the tactic, the result was already sealed. The great lesson of this journey is not limited to the history of a factory or a single type of aircraft, but to a universal truth. Logistics determines strategy. Mass production is not just a matter of numbers. It is the key to shaping any major conflict or enterprise, whether military or economic. Scale and efficiency became the greatest weapons of the conflict, and a country's ability to mobilize its human and industrial resources quickly, and in large numbers, was what ultimately ensured the Allied victory. In a world where war is fought both on the battlefield and in the production of resources, victory was decided on the assembly lines, where millions of workers like Rosa Munro took their positions not with weapons but with tools, with dedication, and with the silent certainty that every bolt tightened and every plane produced contributed to the greater good. It was not the military general, but the anonymous worker who became the hero of the victory. "We were defeated by trucks," said Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, in a bitter confession that, though belated, encapsulated the tragedy of German underestimation. He recognized what Canaris, Oster, and others had already tried to warn. Modern warfare would be won not by secret weapons or ingenious tactics, but by the ability to produce more. Logistics won over ideology, and the mathematics of production was the one that really determined the fate of the Third Reich. Reality does not bow to ideologies. Myths can be powerful, but the truth, no matter how painful, cannot be ignored forever. The lie may be fed for a while, but reality takes revenge, and the ignored truth kills more than bombs. If you were surprised by the data and insights in this video, please like and subscribe to the channel to support our research and the search for historical truth. Comment below what was the most shocking data you discovered, because in doing so, we continue to delve deeper into the real story. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact, which will further expand our understanding of how grand military and industrial strategies shape the fate of nations. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story, where we will explore how other great moments in history have been shaped by the ability to mobilize resources and understand the true essence of power.